This is part 2 of a sapped democracy, the political economy of the structural adjustment program and the political transition in Nigeria, 1983 to 1993. It's a book that is the product of my dissertation, and it was published by University Press of America in 1998. Questions. Nigeria's large external debt, its balance of payments problems, and the critical shortage of foreign exchange that resulted from these problems tilted the balance of power in favor of external actors, including the IMF and World Bank, which made the availability of funding conditional upon the adoption of liberal economic reforms. These reforms involve a dual strategy of short-term macroeconomic stabilization involving the balancing of the budget, tighter control over credit, and curbing inflation, and structural reforms that involved trade liberalization, privatization, and deregulation. SAP reforms are expected to stimulate economic growth under a liberal economic regime. They are directed at integrating the economic situation of states, such as Nigeria's, more fully into the capitalist world economy. How does capitalist development relate to democracy? This broad question has generated heated debates in political philosophy as well as in empirical studies. To date, the resultant controversy remains unresolved. The question is at the heart of my questions in this book. Why did Nigeria choose a combination of liberal reforms and political reform? And why was the dual transition unsuccessful? Other related questions include the following. Is the implementation of the dual transition in Nigeria shaped by A, internal contradictions, or B, external agency? If implementation is shaped by A or B above, what is the prime mover? What is the effect of the politics of implementation on state and society in Nigeria? These questions are aimed at accounting for the causes and outcome of the dual transition on the Nigerian political economy. In such an explanation, relevant analytical issues include the policy components of the dual transition, the response of state and society to market-oriented as opposed to state-led development, the relationship between the state and its creditors, including the international financial institutions, and the effect of these relationships on the interaction between state and society in domestic politics. This, in effect, is a study of how the relations of power determine the nature of economic and political change. The two administrations that preceded the Babangida regime had vehemently refused to comply with IMF conditionalities, and one of them, the Buhari regime, even refused to allow any discussions of Nigeria's political future. The democratically elected Shagari regime was no better. It was corrupt, profligate, and it stifled opposition. In that case, why did a third administration decide to embark on a dual transition? And what changed as a result? These questions are of practical and theoretical significance to political scientists, since they attempt to explain the dynamic interaction between state, society, and external forces during a period of grave economic crisis. And they go to the heart of the matter, in which the power relations among international and domestic actors they go to the heart of the manner in which the power relations among international and domestic actors shaped the possibility of economic recovery and democracy in Nigeria from 1983 to 1993. This work evaluates Nigeria's failed attempt at a dual and simultaneous transition, the one from a state-controlled to a market-oriented economy, and the other from military to democratically elected government. It probes the relationship between SAP and democratization in Nigeria and considers the extent to which the Nigerian state is autonomous vis-à-vis powerful domestic and external actors in the period between 1983 and 1991. I will also engage in a critique of the various perspectives within the literature on development and economic crisis. Here's the argument. The apparent agreement on the existence of a relationship between economic and political development breaks down when the exact nature of the relationship is discussed. The correlation between democratization and economic recovery is a related subject, which itself is subject to significant scholarly contestation. This is due to significant differences in the definition of democracy and how best to achieve economic recovery. I argue that rather than overgeneralize by applying a general theory on the linkage between economic and political reform, local conditions must be taken into consideration. While a dual transition was undertaken in Nigeria, the SAP and the political transition became state policy for radically different reasons. The former became state policy due to a combination of high levels of external indebtedness, negative terms of trade, and the contraction of credit and higher international interest rates, all of which constrained the Nigerian state to introduce measures that were agreeable to its creditors and the multilaterals in order to have access to resources that could be utilized to finance the country's huge external debt. While there was a realization in Nigeria that the economy needed a radical transformation, the homegrown SAP that Nigerians expected was jettisoned, and a World Bank drafted program was foisted on the country. By the Babangida regime. Consequently, there was no domestic support for the program, and a deep-seated resentment and distrust of the regime flourished, which jeopardized its ability to muster widespread support for its agenda. The transition to civilian rule, on the contrary, existed within an international environment which was favorable to democratization. But it initially arose out of the domestic desire for a return to civilian rule. This desire was an expression of the demand for an alternative to SAP. Three factors were responsible for the sabotaging of the political transition process. First, the differing internal logics between liberal economic reform and political reform generated contradictions. While the state needed to narrow the political arena in order to control the opponents of SAP, it needed to widen it to foster political liberalization and democratization. Second, General Babangida's personal ambition stood in the way of the transition and eventually jettisoned it. This is due to the preponderance of the military in Nigeria's politics and the negative effects of the resulting politicization of the military. Third, the fierce intra-elite struggles for power prevented the development of a compromise solution in which one winner was endorsed by all. The outcome of the Babangida regime's policy is a failed dual transition, which was caused by the regime's towing of the IMF and World Bank line on SAP while interfering unduly with the political transition process, leading to the failure of the drive for democratization. If SAP is indeed compatible with democracy, this compatibility can only be based on the affinity of capitalist development and democracy. I argue, on the contrary, that the compatibility of capitalist development and democracy is not a foregone conclusion, and that SAP does not necessarily generate the development of freely competing capitalist interests that its proponents assume will engender political freedom and democratic participation. Instead, being implemented in an actively contested atmosphere, SAP is often imposed by the state through the use of repressive methods. In Nigeria, the implementation of SAP entailed the combination of repression with coercion and the co-optation of the prominent critics of the program. The state was, however, unable to exercise hegemonic leadership. Hegemony being defined as the ability of the state to neutralize popular challenges to its authority by engineering consent through moral and ideological leadership, rather than the use or threat of violence. State autonomy vis-a-vis its creditors and the multilaterals was also seriously limited because of the inability to make independent decisions about economic policies. With the state hemmed in by domestic and external constraints to its power, is sovereignty then meaningful? So I'm going to stop